The boy at the door whispered, trembling, "My mom is in the woods, and they're coming back tonight." The rancher grabbed his rifle, but waiting for him in those woods wasn't just a woman. It was his entire past. By the way, we noticed something small. Most people who watch these stories aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Maybe we get caught up in the moment or just forget to hit the button. But your support truly helps us keep creating stories like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. The rain was falling from the sky like icicles. The wind wasn't just shaking the trees, it felt like it was scattering memories. The darkness of the night had settled over the ranch like a weight, and even the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney of the one-story wooden house couldn't compete with the storm. Richard Keller was a man with calloused hands and tired eyes. He had taken shelter in the barn, repairing an old harness. Routine tasks were like little lifelines that kept a person going, even on the worst days. Even when thunder rolled outside, his fingers kept stitching the leather with a steady rhythm. Then, there was a sound. 3 short knocks. On the door. Not hard, but shaky. Richard looked up. No one ever came at this hour, especially in weather like this. No one. They were either lost or trouble. He quietly set down his tool, stood up, headed toward the farmhouse. Each step sank into the mud. When he opened the door, the wind that rushed in drowned out even the silence of years. And there, in front of the door, stood a child. He was maybe 7 years old. His feet were bare, covered in mud up to his knees. He wore an oversized coat and a crooked hat. But his eyes, that was different. Those weren't the kind of eyes a child should have. They were deep as night and silently screaming. Richard studied him. The boy stared back. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice barely audible. "My mom. She's in the forest. If they come, they'll kill her." The words hit Richard's mind like a bullet. Silence lingered. The wind slapped at the windows. The man slowly lowered his head, grabbed his coat, then reached for the rifle above the fireplace. The boy's gaze followed the gun. Richard asked, "What's your name?" "I'm Leo. My mom's name is Miriam. But sometimes they called her Elsa. I don't know who they are, but they're after us. One had a badge, but he wasn't a cop." Those words changed everything. Something stirred in Richard's heart. That name, Elsa, the secret name of the woman he lost in a fire years ago. One no one else knew. This kid wasn't making up stories. This boy was bringing the past with him. Richard took a step back, but with it came a long-buried memory. That name was still alive somewhere in the ashes of the past. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "Can you walk?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Then let's go." The storm hadn't let up. As they moved into the forest, every tree stood like a threat. Every bush seemed to hide a shadow. Richard raised the lantern to light the way, and Leo followed behind. The path was slippery and winding. The mud beneath their feet was slick and dark, like the traces of the past. But Richard's mind was even more tangled. That name. Elsa. Those eyes. Were they really familiar? "She's hiding deep in the woods," said Leo. "She's hurt. Can't walk. But if they find her..." "Who's they?" Richard asked. "Them. They come quietly. There's fire in their eyes. They don't talk. They just take." That's when Richard realized this boy wasn't alone. Death was right behind him. This wasn't just a cry for help, it was the last chance at salvation. They walked for about an hour. Wet branches scratched their faces, and sometimes rocks looked ready to tumble down. But Leo's small hands gripped Richard's coat like a guide. At last, the boy pointed to a spot. There, under the rocks, in the bushes. Richard approached carefully, rifle in hand, eyes alert. Then, a movement. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw her. A woman, wrapped in a wet blanket, face covered in mud, hair stuck to her forehead. She was hurt. And, yes, her eyes. "Elsa," Richard said, barely believing his own voice. The woman turned her head. When her eyes met his, time froze. "Richard," she whispered. "Is that you?" He crouched down, laid the rifle on the ground. His eyes were filled with tears. You're alive." She smiled faintly. "You thought I was dead." "I did," Richard said. "Everyone said you were. I even thought I buried you myself." Silence fell. Only the sound of the rain remained. Leo quietly came closer and knelt beside his mother. Her wrist was exposed. There was a thin, old silver bracelet on it. The same kind as the one Richard kept in a drawer at home. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a dream. This was the start of a story all over again. But from the darkness of the forest, the shadows of the past were still watching them. And now Richard knew. This wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of a war. Elsa was so weak she was nearly unconscious. Her eyes were open, but filled with the past. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, and the bandage on her left thigh was bleeding. Without saying a word, Richard slung the rifle over his shoulder and picked her up. She was so light, it felt like he was carrying the past itself, not a person. Leo was silent, but his eyes kept darting toward the dark corners of the forest. Which way did they go? Richard asked as he walked. They turned east when I ran, the boy said. But they move like the wind. They surround you without a sound. And their faces never change. In their eyes, there's only hate. Those words reminded Richard of an old skirmish. It had been like that too. When you ran from men whose names you didn't know, you were forced to face the things you left behind. By the time they got back to the house, the storm was still raging. Richard laid Elsa down on the couch near the fireplace. Leo ran to her side, grabbed her hand. Richard heated some water, pressed his hand down on the bandage. The woman groaned but didn't wake. He examined the wound shallow, but if it got infected, it could be a disaster. The silence in the house brought echoes of the past. Elsa's face became clearer over time. The dark circles under her eyes, the lines on her forehead. But that look hadn't changed. This was the woman he had loved years ago on a rainy day while she wore a silver bracelet. But at the same time, she wasn't. This wasn't the face of a ghost, but of a survivor. Richard didn't sleep at all that night. He sat by Elsa's side, the rifle right beside him. Every now and then, he stepped outside and listened. The wind had died down for a while. But what gnawed at him was the silence. Because silence was how they came. With the first light of morning, Elsa opened her eyes. She spoke in a weak whisper. I couldn't run. They saw me. One of them caught up. Shot me. But Leo, he got away. Is he okay? Richard nodded. You're okay now too. Don't talk. Just rest. But Elsa shook her head. No, this is just a stop. They'll come. They always do. I don't even know how many places they know about. But if we stay here, they'll burn you too. I don't want you hurt because of me. Richard gently ran his hands over her head. I couldn't protect you from them years ago. But now, I have a chance. Just then, Leo walked in with a piece of paper in his hand. Something was drawn on it in charcoal. A mountain pass, 2 bushes, a mark. They're waiting here, he said. My mom used to draw this. She said if they couldn't catch me, they'd take her there. Richard stared at the paper for a long time. It could have been a trap, but his instincts told him something else. The only reason they wanted Elsa alive was because they wanted something from her. Evening came. Elsa was asleep. Leo was in the corner, wrapped in a blanket, flipping through a book. And then, a crack, a shadow behind the door. Silent, but real. Richard grabbed the rifle, stepped toward the window. No one outside. But on the ground, a mark, a horseshoe, fresh. Not even the rain had washed it away. Leo, he said sharply, don't leave your mother's side. And don't make a sound. He opened the door slowly. Moonlight slipped through the clouds. Richard stepped onto the porch, moving carefully. The barn on his right, the old well on his left. Everything was quiet, but his instincts wouldn't shut up. Then a whistle, not the wind, a human sound. When he turned around, someone lunged from the shadows. A man, piercing eyes, a half-smile on his face. A gun in his hand. Richard moved quickly, swung his rifle, but the man was too close. A struggle broke out. The weapon hit the ground, and they both crashed into the mud. Fists flew. Richard got the upper hand, but the man hissed. You're too late, Keller. You can't stop us. That woman. She's ours now. What do you want from her? Richard yelled. The man just laughed, but his eyes widened for a second with fear. Because behind him stood Leo, holding an axe. And without hesitation, he had stepped forward to help Richard. Richard didn't miss the chance. He landed a blow to the man's jaw, knocking him out. The way Leo held that axe, it wasn't like a child. It was like someone ready to die for his mother. And in that moment, Richard understood. This boy wasn't just carrying his mother. He was carrying the truth. And that truth had now brought them face to face with death. But they weren't alone anymore. The morning was unusually quiet. The clouds from the night still covered the sky, but the wind had stopped, and even the birds seemed to have retreated. Richard sat on the porch, watching the man who had been unconscious all night. The man's wrists were tied, his mouth tightly gagged. Richard had the rifle resting on his knees, his eyes distant but alert. Inside, Elsa was resting, and Leo was quietly combing his mother's hair. The tenderness of those small hands, it stuck in your throat. When the man finally opened his eyes, Richard nudged him with his foot. "You're going to talk," he said, "or this silence will kill you." The man resisted for a while, but his eyes still burned with arrogance. "You were too late, Keller," he said again, his voice muffled. "By the time you thought she was buried, we were already on her trail." "Who's we?" Richard asked, leaning closer. "Who sent you?" The man turned his head to the side, but in his eyes, there wasn't belief, just fanaticism. When Richard moved his finger a little closer to the trigger, the man muttered, "The elders. The ones from the mountain. They give the orders. We carry them out. The woman. She was born on their sacred land. And her blood still claims that land. With that boy, she's now a threat." Richard stood up, slowly shook his head. "If a woman trying to protect her land is what you call a threat, maybe you're the one in the wrong." The man smiled. "There is no wrong, only duty. And they are coming." Richard paused for a moment. Then he walked inside. Elsa had just opened her eyes. She was pale, but there was more awareness in her gaze. Leo sat beside her, holding her wrist. The boy hadn't slept. He had just waited. "Wake up," said Richard. "We can't stay here anymore. We can't leave before dark," Elsa whispered. "We'll be seen in daylight." "I know," said Richard. "But they'll follow us at night too. And now I know. They're not just after you. They don't want Leo around either. That boy, maybe he's not your blood, but he's your spirit. And that's enough for them." Elsa closed her eyes. A single tear fell, but she wiped it away quickly. "Then we have to go? But carefully. Running isn't enough. We have to disappear." "How?" asked Richard. "They'll track us. On horses, on foot, maybe even in dreams." Elsa pulled the blanket aside with her left hand. Under her knee was an old map, engraved into leather. "Only the two of us ever knew this route. Hayne and me. Beyond the mountain pass, there's an abandoned mine. The tunnels are still intact. If we make it through, we can get out." Richard froze for a moment. "Did you say Hayne?" he asked. Elsa nodded. "My sister. We grew up together. You were her heart. But after the fire, everything fell apart. Even I thought you were dead." Richard's face tensed. Another piece of the past had opened. Another name he had buried in his heart echoed again. But now he had to carry the present, not the past. Before sunset, they got everything ready. Elsa could walk a little, but Richard was determined to put her on the horse. Leo packed a small sack with the map, food, and some medicine. Richard had carefully oiled the rifle and strapped on 2 full ammo belts. But whenever they planned to move, something delayed them. Because Leo heard something behind the door. One of the trees moved, the boy whispered. "There's no wind." But a branch creaked. Richard immediately stepped out onto the porch. He raised the gun. His eyes locked onto the edge of the forest. Then a shadow. And then a voice. Not just a voice anymore, not even a scream. More like a command. "Surrender." Then came the explosions. 3 gunshots. Richard threw himself to the ground, pulling Leo inside. Elsa grabbed the wall to keep from falling. The rifle fired back, but the shadows were approaching from multiple directions. "The back door," Richard shouted. "Get to the mine now." Elsa crawled toward the door, Leo right beside her. After firing his last round, Richard moved behind the barn to cover them. Bullets slammed into the walls, wood cracked and splintered. Footsteps echoed from the rear path too. Richard's eyes caught the feed sacks piled near the animals. An idea struck him. He hurled a burning torch into the hay storage. Flames burst to life immediately. The enemy fire paused. In that moment, Richard caught up to Elsa and Leo. "Where to?" Elsa panted. "The mine," said Richard. "But first, we're putting some of these bastards in the ground." And with those words, Richard was no longer just a rancher of the past. He was a man at war for the lives of the people he loved. With only one thought in his mind, he would protect them, even if it cost him everything. As the flames tore through the night, the smoke rising from the barn looked like a warning written across the dark sky. "We're here, and we will find you." Richard carried Elsa on his back while Leo walked ahead, reading the piece of the map under the lantern light. They followed an old creek bed, pushing through knee-high bushes. Every step felt like a lifetime spent trying not to make a sound. Elsa's wound had started bleeding again, but she didn't complain. She clenched her teeth and held her breath, because she knew even a moment of weakness could mean the end. How far is the pass? Richard asked. Leo stopped, looked at the map. Behind a hill. Maybe 300 steps. But the entrance is blocked by rocks. We might have to dig. We don't have time, Richard said. If the trackers are close, they've already caught our scent. Just then, a crack. From behind. Followed by footsteps. Quiet but certain. Leo turned off the lantern. Richard placed one hand on Elsa's shoulder and grabbed the rifle with the other. The three of them crouched into the bushes. Even their breathing sounded like a threat in that silence. A man passed by them. Just a silhouette. He didn't carry a gun, he had a knife. He wasn't there to fight, he was there to silence. Richard tracked him with his eyes. If they had made eye contact, he would have fired without hesitation. But the man passed without noticing them. And then, Leo, still on his knees, slowly pointed downward, the tunnel entrance. The rocks were piled up. But if you looked closely, it wasn't shaped by nature, it had been arranged by hands. Elsa whispered, Hayne and I once hid here. It was a shelter. Now, it could be a grave. Richard didn't answer. He quickly pushed the stones aside. Elsa, bleeding on his back, held her breath. Leo, with terrifying patience for his age, watched their surroundings. Finally, a narrow passage opened. Damp, musty, and black. Get in, Richard said. You two first. Leo held his mother's hand. Elsa let out a sigh and slid into the darkness. Then the boy. Lastly, Richard, pulling a stone back to partly conceal the entrance. Once inside, their eyes didn't adjust right away. There were only footsteps, breathing, and echoes of the past. Elsa moved by leaning against the wall. With every step, she slipped along the stone floor. An old mine cart still sat inside the tunnel. Rusted, but the tracks, still solid. The tunnel goes east from here, Elsa said. If it hasn't collapsed, there's still an exit. But then a sound came from deeper underground. The clang of metal hitting stone. Someone was in the tunnel. They followed us, Leo whispered. Richard raised his rifle. He fixed the lantern to the wall and tucked Elsa behind the cart. Leo joined her. Then footsteps. We're getting closer. The first man appeared at the tunnel's corner. As the light hit his face, Richard recognized him instantly. One of the same men. No badge, but he acted like he was the law. He was grinning. Give us the boy, he said. And the woman. Or we'll just leave you here. Richard pushed his rifle forward. If you want to leave me here, you'll have to die first. The man laughed. You think we haven't crushed men like you before? Just then, a bullet ricocheted off the tunnel wall. Elsa didn't scream, but she flinched. Leo clung to his mother's neck. Richard crouched and took aim. But before he fired, he noticed a shift in the tunnel wall. The stones were loose. He moved closer to the ground, touched the wall. Sounds. Water. A slow leak from underground. This tunnel was ready to collapse. Leo, he said quickly, take your mom and run east. No matter what, don't stop. What about you? The boy whispered. I'll come too. But first, I need to see how loyal these rocks are. Elsa, her eyes filling with tears, said, No, I won't let you die for them. I'm not dying for them, Elsa, Richard said. I live so that you can. And with those words, he grabbed the pickaxe propped against the tunnel ceiling. As the men advanced, Richard swung it with all his strength at the weak spot above. The first stones fell. Then dust. One man screamed. Another tried to run. But when Richard struck the second blow, the tunnel literally came crashing down on them. Leo held tightly to his mother's hand, dragging her toward another exit. The rumble behind them made it unclear whether Richard was still alive. But Leo had only one thought in his mind. That man. He was my protector. He wasn't my father. But he was the only one who ever saved my life. The last image before the tunnel collapsed was burned into Elsa's mind like a knife. Richard, holding the pickaxe above his head, eyes full of resolve, yelling, run. And then the sound of stones, dust, and screams crashing down. Now, that noise had been replaced by the silence of death. Despite the pain in her bleeding leg, Elsa crawled after Leo, whispering only a prayer. She hadn't believed in anything for years, but now, losing this child, this hope, and Richard, she couldn't bear it. The tunnel was dark, and it was hard to breathe. The boy crawled ahead, pulling his mother through the narrow passageways. Spiderwebs hung along the rusty rails, moss clung to the walls. The earth itself seemed to want to spit them out before it collapsed further. We're close, Leo said. I see light. and he did faint light leaking through a narrow crack. It was an emergency exit once used by miners years ago. Leo pried the stones apart and pulled himself out. He pressed his hands into the dirt, breathed, then turned back to help his mother through. When Elsa saw the sky again, she had to squint. But the first thing she did was look back. The tunnel entrance had completely caved in. "Richard," she whispered, "you gave this to us." Leo said nothing, but his eyes filled with tears. "He's not coming back, is he?" Elsa couldn't answer for a moment. Then she dropped to her knees and hugged her son. "I don't know," she said, "but if we live, it's because of him." For the first time in days, the open sky was clear. Birds were singing again, but the peace was only a temporary shelter. As Elsa and Leo moved along a narrow path on the mountainside, they were no longer just surviving, they were searching for a place to live. Elsa's leg was getting worse. Her fever was rising. She could barely stand. At one point, she collapsed, out of breath. Leo rushed to her side. "Mom, we have to get up. They could still be chasing us." Elsa closed her eyes. Her lips were dry. "I can't go on," she said. "No," Leo shouted. "Don't leave me. If you go, I have no one left." Tears rolled down the woman's cheeks. She reached out and touched her son's face. "I'm not leaving you. Everything that made you who you are is what's left of me." In that moment, they noticed a shadow approaching in the distance. Leo squinted. Someone on horseback. They tried to move, but Elsa couldn't. Leo stood in front of her, pulled out his little pocket knife. His heart was racing, knees shaking, but he didn't move. The rider came closer. A cloud of dust surrounded him. And then Leo's eyes filled with tears. Richard, it was really him. A bandage on his shoulder, scratches on his face, covered in dust, but he was alive. Before getting off the horse, his eyes locked onto Elsa. "You made it out," he said, his voice thick. Leo ran to him. Richard dropped to one knee and hugged the boy. You opened the way for us," Leo said. "But how did you?" "A man who's seen a lot knows exactly where to lean before something collapses," Richard said with a smile. The old support beams beside the tunnel were still solid. Breathing was tough but not impossible. Elsa lifted her head. Tears were streaming down her face. You're alive." Richard walked to her. He knelt and touched her face. "You were my reason." "My leg. It's bad," Elsa whispered. "Before we go, I have to tell you, Leo's not my son." "I know," Richard said. Elsa looked surprised. "How?" "To be someone's child, you don't need the same blood. Just the same courage." When Leo heard Richard's words, he smiled softly. That smile wasn't born from surviving a collapse, but from beginning a life. That night, they made a small camp just outside the forest. Richard cleaned and rewrapped Elsa's leg. Leo started a fire and heated water in an old can. None of them spoke much, but the silence wasn't from fear anymore. It was out of respect for being together. "Tomorrow," Richard said, "we'll head down into the valley. I know someone there. He used to help people on the run. Now he lives quietly on a small farm. Maybe he can hide us for a while." Elsa nodded. "But isn't that just running?" Richard stared into the fire. "No, this is starting." The next morning, as the path leading down into the valley lit up under the sun, 3 figures could be seen. One was a wounded but dignified woman. Another, a child with eyes full of the future. And leading them, a man with a rifle on his shoulder and years of wear on his back. As Richard moved through the brush, he kept glancing back at Elsa. She was still tired, but walking. Every step wasn't for herself, it was for Leo. And that stirred admiration in Richard's eyes. At the end of the valley, a small stone-walled, one-story cabin appeared. An elderly woman sat out front. Her hair was gray, her hands wrinkled, but her eyes were sharp and warm. "Richard Keller," the woman said when she saw him. "If you're still alive, fate must be stubborn." Richard smiled. "Not as stubborn as you, Greta." Greta looked at Elsa and Leo. She didn't ask a single question. She simply opened the door. "Come in. Rest your souls first, before your wounds." Inside, a wood stove burned, and the steam from the tea filled the ceiling. Elsa sat on the couch. Greta checked her leg and nodded. "Wrapped well, but there's still risk of infection. She needs rest." Leo was helping in the kitchen, carrying plates with his little hands, carefully setting up the chairs. Greta turned to him and smiled. "Kids like you bring hope into the world." That night, there was silence in Greta's home, but not from fear, from peace. After years of running, their feet had finally found a place to stop. But in the morning, the footsteps returned. Greta looked out the window. "You've got visitors, Richard." 3 men were approaching the door. Same torn uniforms, same crooked badges, same eyes full of hate. But this time, Richard wasn't alone. He opened the door, rifle behind it. "It ends here," he said. The men stepped forward. "We want the woman. And the boy. Give them up willingly, and no blood needs to be spilled." Elsa stepped inside. She had a stick in her hand, using it like a cane. "I'm not their burden," she said. "I'm not their past. I am their future." The men didn't flinch. They raised their weapons. Just as they were about to fire, Greta blew a whistle. From the back hillside, 4 riders came down. Once trackers, now quiet living farmers. Old friends of Greta's. Guns were lowered. The men hesitated. A glance exchanged, and they backed off. Richard shut the door. "That was the last of them," he said. "From now on, we look forward." Months passed. Greta's home now had 3 new residents. Elsa healed more each day. The old wounds, both physical and emotional, slowly began to scar over. Leo was now waking up early to feed the animals, learning herbal remedies from Greta. Elsa had become a quiet teacher. She no longer needed to tell her story, she lived it. And Richard, he now hung his rifle behind the door, not on his back. One evening, Elsa sat on the porch. Leo was inside making tea. Richard took a seat on a stool, carving a piece of wood with his old pocket knife. Elsa watched him. "What is it?" she asked. Richard held it up, a small tree figurine. "Deep roots, wide branches. A symbol of a home," he said. "But a home isn't walls. It's the people you can grow roots beside." Elsa was quiet for a moment, then gently placed her hand on his. "Maybe you once loved me, but if you're the man who loves me now, then I'm here." Richard looked into her eyes. There were no more ghosts, no more shadows. Just life itself. "So am I," he said. Years later, a small sign hung at the entrance to the farm. Keller and family. Leo was now a young man. He'd built a little chicken coop with the first wood he ever worked, feeding the hens in Greta's place. Elsa sat on the porch, rocking a newborn daughter in her arms. Richard sat beside Leo, carving another figure with the same old knife. The sky was clear. The wind was quiet. No threats lingered. And in the middle of it all, the echo of that very first whisper still lingered in the air. "My mama's in the woods." But now, the woods were no longer dark. And that whisper was no longer alone. We're just a few steps away from reaching our first 1,500 subscribers, our growing family. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you to everyone who's brought us this far. With your support, we grow stronger with every story. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time.